So what I'm going to do in the short time that we have allotted is to try and bring in something of a more Asian perspective to the proceedings. And the danger of that is I'm going to leap a bit through time and space, but hopefully I can show something of what it means to talk about liberty as a discourse that happens also beyond the Western civilizational world. So we're going to look at that. And one of the things we'll see is the way that, as opposed to the Greek state model, we've got something that comes out of sort of a tribal context that maybe can tell us more about ways of thinking about democracy and about liberty itself. So I'm going to share screen, the magic of our technological world in action. So if we think about a global history of liberty rather than merely a single culture version of things, we want to think about what it means to work a little bit outside of the usual narrative of freedom that is generally kind of the dominant picture that we inherit in the West. And so we want to look a little further than the way that it tends to be represented to us in the narrative that we have. A lot of the narrative that we inherit, and I think it's helpful to see all of us here as inheriting a kind of a picture of what freedom is, that narrative is rich in a kind of history and a rhetoric and a story with a lot of drama attached to it. And I just want to speak about it partly in terms of the American version, partly because it's been such an influential way of thinking. If we look back at the Constitution, the American Declaration, we see the classic words. But as we look through them, let's think a little bit about how much rhetoric is present. Rhetoric isn't good or bad. It's just important for seeing all that makes up the notion. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Notice that sacred is already there, that it cannot be merely human, there must be more. And indeed that it has to be sacred, partly because, unfortunately, they are deniable. So we have to reach for more authority. That all men are created equal and independent. There we have the notion of a kind of an individual, autonomous being there. But from that equal creation, notice creation, again, we have to call on an extra-human authority. They derive rights, inherent and inalienable. Oh gosh, here is rights discourse, such a contested and complex feature of our modern political world. Inherent and inalienable precisely because freedom can be taken away. The right to it has to be inalienable. And among these rights are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And so we have already here embedded the contrast between Isaiah Berlin and Charles Taylor's negative freedom, mere liberty to be, and the pursuit of happiness, positive liberty to flourish. But notice the way the narrative continues. John F. Kennedy's quote, "The cost of freedom is always high." Suddenly, freedom is not merely a pleasant thing we have. It's a price. It's a difficult and painful thing, a price we always pay. But Americans have always paid it. So there's a history and a precedent to live up to. And one path we shall never choose, a kind of prophecy and direction for the future. And that is the path of surrender or submission. So surrender and submission and freedom are now in a kind of binary, polar set of possibilities. Surrender and submission to whom or what is not completely clear. But notice the power of the story that's created. And of course, the truth is we know that liberty is much more complex than that. And as we've already been seeing, has a complex history that spans Roman law, Hobbes, Locke, Bentham, Mill, Hegel, Green and Bradley, Nietzsche, Arendt, Berlin, Sen, Taylor, and others. It's an ongoing discourse that we're struggling to define in a very clear way. Liberty famously can be non-interference of the physical or the mental being, or merely individual free will, not only hopefully expressed in mind, but also in action, or more self-ownership. And of course, that's a definition that contrasts with the slavery-related origins of the notion, or self-governance, which is when we get closer to a state model. It may simply be being in the social sphere without conflict with the liberty of others, the great challenge of a many-personed freedom. And that can manifest in the self-governing political community that we sometimes today call democracy. But in some ways, that all fits into the negative side of the equation. There's also the positive notion of liberty as having positive options and power to do. And that links to a larger picture, which isn't always fully expressed, of what it would look like for both individuals and cultures to exist in natural expression of their being and in a trajectory of self-determined, through history, ongoing growth. So actually, liberty is a more complicated thing than we like to think it is. It's really not a single idea, but a challenge. Sometimes it can seem as if the West thinks about liberty as if it would be an easy thing to achieve, almost as if the model is based on some sort of island's conception of individual groups and states. It's easy for islands not to be invaded. It seems at least easy for them to exist in their own autonomous being. Perhaps that's because of the Greek model or the sort of the English background of so many Enlightenment scholars on the topic. But of course, the truth is it's much more complicated than that. Liberty is a puzzle that for the rest of the world, especially those not on islands, but in fact in deeply entwined, complex land masses where there are different languages, ethnicities, etc., it's a puzzle that means really it's about understanding ways of living that are interlocking, reciprocal and mutual, as well as affording individual liberty. And I'm thinking here partly in terms of Fred down there, who writes about this in Freedom East and West and his other work, where he tries to set out something like a pan-global, Asian and Western model of what liberty would be, of what freedom would look like. And we get closer to something like, and this is a thinker I draw on a lot, Gadamer's Hegelian dialectically complex conception of freedom. What does freedom look like when you're also always naturally bound up with others? So this lets us start off on our journey around the world. And we leap, first of all, through time and space to China. China at the conjunction of the Warring States period and the Hundred Schools era of thought. This is around the 6th to the 3rd centuries BC. Note that the Warring States period coincides with the Hundred Schools of Thought period. It's precisely when we've got multiple polities, and there we have a map of China in the background, multiple polities on this interlocking world, not least because agriculture and water access links them all together, as well as, of course, trade. It's that situation that prompts an incredibly rich flourishing of philosophy, and the philosophy is mostly political philosophy, bound up with concepts of human nature. So we can imagine ourselves on a road in Shandong where Mencius or Mengzi pauses, having spent a lot of time trying to advise kings of the different warring states on how best to rule. And the map that you can see there, actually, those are maps that are linked to the many different philosophers of the warring states period. There's a philosopher for each region. And we've really got individuals trying to think through how best to facilitate the well-being and freedom of their own particular people. Mengzi is not very excited about the success he's had with the kings that he's advising, and the stories that are told about his life tell us that he goes to debate human nature and politics at the Jixia Academy with other great thinkers of the time. The Jixia Academy is a kind of a Plato's Athens of ancient China, and there we find Confucians, Daoists, naturalists, legalists, mohists, all discussing the ideal state and the way that it deals with humans. One of the biggest debates in that world is between the legalists, who believe that basically human nature is defined by aggression, and the Daoists and other naturalists who think that human nature is defined by actually a very functional ability to grow in mutual respect and concern and flourish through their lives without friction. So we've got kind of a pessimist and an optimist model. And it's worth remembering that while the legalists ended up being effectively co-opted by the growing power of Chinese empire, in fact, the other schools were much more positive about a kind of a freedom facilitating model of government. So early Daoists, early Confucianists like Confucius himself and Mengzi, also the naturalists who believed in following the elements, humans have a kind of a natural capacity, and the mohists all thought that freedom is possible. It's about a kind of an organic, shared form of life. Mohists particularly united scholars and working men to argue for impartial care of all people beyond merely the family and clan that were the focus of Confucius. And they were against state expansion. So Mengzi himself defended the small state of Song, according to stories, against the powerful King Chu and prevented Chu from invading. Now, all of this was seen to function well as long as government happened according to the mandate of heaven. And it's worth remembering, again, that notion is co-opted, but originally it means merely the state's natural expression of the people's will. So the mandate of heaven is really about a form of organic liberty. Heaven, the book of history says, sees as our people see. Heaven hears as our people hear. Heaven is compassionate toward the people, and what the people desire, heaven will be found to bring about. So the Chinese model tries to point us to a notion of liberty that is about a kind of frictionless, organic, communal activity that naturally nourishes the natural flourishing of individuals within a system where governance actually mirrors the people's will. Ongoing flourishing and a confidence that if people are able to flourish naturally, they will actually interlock together in a positive and mutually reciprocal organic way is central to the Chinese notion. And even though it's the legalist model that becomes dominant within the empires, this remains in the background even today as a major part of Chinese thinking about liberty. Let's jump to India very quickly. And let's think about what it looks like to consider the Gangetic plain in around 200 BC. And we know a little bit about this because of Kautilya's Arthaśāstra, which is an ancient text sometimes seen as the Machiavelli of the ancient Indian world. The Arthaśāstra is not like the Mosists. It's actually extremely pessimistic and basically sees the fight for land across that Gangetic plain region, one of the only really fertile regions for a long distance, sees it as the basis of extreme competition in all things. So famously, the Arthaśāstra develops this kind of bullseye concentric circles model of state, where it says, imagine the blue circle in the middle is the state. States will always be in conflict with their immediate adjacent neighbours. It's just the nature of land and the nature of community that it will always seek to expand. So you always basically hate your neighbour, but that's okay because your neighbour hates their neighbour, who is therefore your friend. Of course, the people beyond your friends will then be the friends of your enemy and therefore your enemies. And we get this concentric circle of expanding sort of spheres of animosity and uneasy alliance. It's a strange picture, although in many ways it fits with a wider range of philosophies that are pessimistic about the possibilities of freedom without extreme control. The Arthaśāstra says, when the law of punishment is kept in abeyance, it gives rise to such disorder as is implied in the proverb of fishes. If you don't punish, if you don't control, then the big fish eat the little fish. On the upside, the king who keeps that punishment in order is meant to ensure that those who are below him take care of slaves. He's meant to provide maintenance for the poor. He's meant to prevent corruption, which actually is the major locus of non-freedom in the ways of thinking that you find in that classical world. Corruption is, in fact, the problem. Where can we find freedom in ancient India? Bollywood, no, that's not quite right. Where we can find freedom in ancient India is if you read the text in the lives of tribes, indigenous peoples of such different ethnic and cultural and linguistic worlds and landscapes that, in fact, it's better to form some kind of alliance with them than to take them over, remained one sphere in which it was possible to stay free. Tribes become a major factor. And even today, India is extremely proud of its many freedom fighters, and many of its freedom fighting queens, two of whom we see in these images from recent Bollywood films celebrating their power, their girl power. But what's interesting is India likes to think about them in terms of the differentness of their ethnic and cultural specificity. So even in the images, we can see these very different, distinctive Indian cultures coming out. It's precisely this sense of the freedom that goes along with cultural difference that starts to inform India's notion of liberty as cultural autonomy and support for kind of cooperation, amongst cooperative flourishing, which leads to a natural development of all within an affirmation of complexity. And thinkers like Amartya Sen pick up on that. Now, just very briefly, I want to kind of pull this together in terms of what this means in relation to the wider range of freedom notions we know. So we come now further west toward the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East. Now, just briefly, I want to point to the way that, in fact, both in the Israelite history we see in the Hebrew Bible and in the Islamic history that we see expressed in the Quran, actually, it's a cluster of tribes on a piece of land, where actually those tribes are often relatively itinerant, where the land itself is complicated as an ownership space because it's not all that fertile. The way that they develop a notion of freedom is through what we might call citizen theologies, the freedom of divine contracts, where what you need is a God who can assure that all of these tribes together have a shared connection to that authority and not to other persons. It's a kind of liberty of individual mutual determination of diverse groups within a secure world guaranteed by a higher authority. Importantly, it's a more than human authority. It's God, rather than a person who might try to struggle. So coming to a kind of closing thought about this, if the Western model is partly about autonomous islands that have their separate being, the Asian models and the wider range of models have to acknowledge that, in fact, it's about a balanced ethnic and cultural interdependency. The truth is people are always surrounded by others. And the question then is, why prefer peace? Why sustain that diversity rather than take over those around you and try and assimilate them? And why want people in their diversity to have their own autonomous self-direction and flourishing? Why not bring them in, as it were, and turn them into part of your world? And I end with the thought of China. The first time I went to China, I collected these beautiful banknotes, not only because they're amazing works of art, but because they also represent a China that, for some reason at that time, was very committed to the idea of celebrating its cultural and ethnic diversity. China, of course, is full of diverse tribes. And that leaves us as a final point with this question. China both wants that diversity and it also wants to be able to bring them under control. The challenge for a global conception of liberty is not so much to secure the autonomy of the islands, it's rather to say, how can we want to have diverse groups following their own self-determined progression and flourishing over time? Why should we encourage cultures to flourish in their own terms and not only in our own? And I think then in that context, hopefully what we get is a picture of why we might not only cherish liberty, but cherish other people's liberty as an appealing factor. Even though it might be nice to get hold of their land and their material, why do we want to have them be free around us and not just under our control?
Thank you, Jessica.